You ever notice how everybody in America has apparently become an extremist? You've got conservatives being labeled fascist, liberals are labeled communists, Republicans are labeled threats to democracy, Democrats are labeled destroying the country, parents are domestic terrorists. And then you've got protesters as anarchists, activists as radicals, police are authoritarian, and billionaires are villains. So 349 million people in the country, and somehow everybody's dangerous except the one person doing the labeling. Now, here's the question. If everyone is a terrorist, who exactly is left to be a normal citizen? I mean, did the country suddenly become full of extremists? Or did the definition of extremist quietly expand until it included anyone inconvenient? Because if the country suddenly radicalized overnight, when exactly did that happen? Was there some Tuesday morning where half of the country woke up as extremists? Or did something else change? Because when words start appearing everywhere all at once, it usually means the word changed. The meaning is now different. And now that's interesting, because if that's true, something else doesn't add up. And that's what brings us to something economists understand very well: inflation. So, welcome back to Country Cynic. We follow the timeline, we follow the incentives, we look at the numbers, because sooner or later, the narrative has to face the math. So, let's see how this story holds up. Economists talk a lot about inflation when money loses value. If a dollar used to buy a gallon of milk, and now it barely buys half, that's inflation. But it turns out political language works much the same way. Words that used to describe very specific situations start getting thrown around so often that they eventually lose their meaning altogether. Think about how casually some of the very serious words get used today: fascist, communist, extremists, radical, terrorists, threat to democracy, fraud, indoctrination. Now, here's the question. If every political opponent is a fascist, what word are we supposed to use for an actual fascist? If every disagreement is extremism, what does real extremism even look like anymore? Because historically, those words described very specific behaviors and ideologies. But today, they often just describe someone we strongly disagree with. And when every disagreement becomes a national emergency, eventually people stop taking the language seriously. Because when everything is extreme, nothing is extreme. That raises another question. If the words are losing their meaning, how do people still end up being treated like extremists? Now that's interesting, because if that's true, then something else doesn't add up. Because once you start watching closely, you realize this escalation follows a pattern, almost like a ladder. Once you start paying attention, you'll notice something strange, and that political arguments don't just escalate randomly. They follow a very specific sequence. And I call it the extremism ladder. Step one is there's a disagreement. Someone has a different opinion. And then step two, we spread misinformation. So now they're not just wrong, they're ignorant. Step three is dangerous. Now their ideas are harmful. Step four, extremists. Now they're radical. And then step five is terrorists. And once someone reaches that rung of the ladder, they are no longer treated like a citizen. They're treated like a threat. And now here's the question. How many Americans actually climbed that ladder? How many just got pushed up it by someone else? Because these days, We don't climb the ladder anymore. We skip the middle steps. Disagreement jumps right to extremism, and extremism jumps straight to terrorism, which raises a pretty fair question. If everyone keeps being pushed up this ladder, who's exactly left at the bottom? And who's doing the pushing? And now that's really interesting because if that's true, something else doesn't add up. Because if this ladder exists, we should be able to see it happen in real life. And one of the clearest examples happens somewhere you wouldn't normally expect to hear counterterrorism language, a school board meeting. A few years ago, something unusual started happening in this country. You see, parents were showing up at school board meetings angry about curriculum, pandemic policies, and education decisions. And that part isn't anything new. Parents arguing with school board officials is practically an American tradition. But in 2021, something changed. The National School Boards Association sent a letter to then President Biden's Department of Justice raising concerns about threats towards school officials. The letter referenced the Patriot Act, and that's historically been associated with counterterrorism investigations. Shortly after, of course, the FBI started to coordinate with local authorities regarding threats towards school administrators. And now, to some observers, this made perfect sense. Threats against public officials absolutely should be taken seriously. But to others, it looked like angry parents at school meetings were suddenly being talked about in the same language normally used for national security threats, which raises a pretty reasonable question. When did arguing about homework start sounding like counterterrorism? Because if every heated PTA meeting becomes a federal investigation, what exactly counts as normal civic participation anymore? And now that's really interesting because if that's true, then something else doesn't add up. Because the same labeling dynamic shows up whenever major protests happen. And one of the biggest examples happened just a year earlier. Take the protests following the death of George Floyd. Depending on who was describing those events, the participants were labeled very differently. Some described them as civil rights protesters and community activists. Others described them as rioters, anarchists, and extremists. Same events, same crowds, same footage, but two completely different interpretations, which raises a very uncomfortable question. How can the same protest be a civil rights movement on one channel and an extremist uprising on another? If the footage is the same, what exactly changed? And now that's interesting because if that's true, then something else doesn't add up. Because we watched the exact same labeling dynamic happen again just a few months later. Only this time, the stakes were much higher. January 6, 2021. I'm sure that that's a day that most people remember exactly where they were and exactly what they were doing as those events unfolded. Because after all, it was a little bit historic. But depending on the commentator, the people involved were described as insurrectionists, extremists, or domestic terrorists. Yet others described them as protesters, patriots, and political prisoners. Same event, same videos, same building, but very different labels, which raises a question that no one seems comfortable asking. If two completely different realities can come from the exact same footage, how much of politics is actually interpretation? Because once language becomes tribal, words stop functioning as definitions. They start functioning as weapons. And now that's really interesting because if that's true, something else isn't adding up here. Because if language is that powerful, someone, somewhere, has an incentive to use it. Now, here's what most people miss. Calling someone an extremist doesn't just insult them, it changes what you are allowed to do to them. Think about it for a moment. Because if someone is just a political opponent, you have to debate them. And if someone is misinformed, you have to try to correct them. But if someone is labeled an extremist, you can completely ignore them. And if someone is labeled a terrorist, you can completely justify suppressing them. Which raises a really uncomfortable question. Is the goal to win an argument or to remove an opponent? Because throughout history, the fastest way to gain power has always been the same. Convince people that the other opponent is dangerous. And now that's interesting, because if that's true, something else isn't adding up here. Because political labels don't work alone unless people accept them. You, the people, me, the people, and we, the people, have to accept these words for them to mean anything, which means something else must be helping this system along. And what could that be? Human beings love categories: conservative, liberal, rich, poor, men, women, urban, rural, gay, straight. And once people start getting sorted into groups, we start making assumptions about them. All conservatives are racist. All liberals hate America. All rich people are greedy. All poor people are lazy, which raises a pretty ironic question. If stereotypes are so harmful, why do we rely on them constantly in politics? Because once people get sorted into large enough categories, you never have to deal with individuals again. And now that's really interesting, because if that's true, then something else isn't adding up. Because if this behavior was unpopular, the media and political class would eventually stop doing it. But they don't, which means something else must be rewarding it. So we like to follow the incentives. And that's important when trying to understand, why does this keep happening? And there are three reasons. First are algorithms, because outrage spreads faster than nuance. Second, you've got media incentives. A headline that says political disagreement continues isn't much of a headline, but an extremist threat emerges as a headline will get a lot of attention. And then third is political strategy. Fear mobilizes voters better than persuasion ever will, which leads us to one of the most uncomfortable questions of all. What if outrage isn't a flaw in the system? What if outrage is the business model? And now that's interesting, because if that's true, something else doesn't add up here. Because democracy can't function if half the population is treated like enemies. And that leads to the real danger. Democracy depends on one fragile belief: that your political opponents are still legitimate participants in the system. But once your opponents become extremists, compromise stops looking like negotiation, and it starts looking like surrender, which raises the biggest question of our entire conversation. If every election is a battle against extremists, how long can democracy actually survive that mindset? And now that's interesting, because if it's true, something else isn't adding up. Because in real life, most people don't look anything like the caricatures I see on TV news. Look, I can see the appeal. It is a whole lot easier to sort people into categories than it is to try to understand them. But the truth is, most folks I've met in this country don't look anything like the villains that you see on the news. They're just trying to take care of their families, do their jobs, and live their lives. And it turns out that reality is a lot more complicated than the labels we like to assign to people. Anyway, that's just how I see it. Y'all take care of each other out there, all right?